Hello, everyone. Well, I am back again for another week of what is going to be somewhat of a two-part mini-series within this larger series of the Never-Ending Story. What I preached on last week, as some of you might recall, was talking about Hebrews chapter 2 and about how the book of Hebrews seems to be being structured like the tabernacle itself. And we talked last week about that passage in Hebrews 2, which was also read in part today, about Christ being put to death, and by doing so, releasing us from that grip of death that is on us. I want to, again, remind us of sort of the illustration that I have kind of put this within. Remember last week, I began with a story about not continuing on a journey that was once begun. And some of you, I don't know if have a similar story, but my story was this: as a young boy going off on a journey with my mom at the time. And of course, we were on this journey to go visit stone circles around England. And of course, there's nothing that strikes excitement quite like stone circles for a 10-year-old boy. Ah, yes. I want to go. Please, Mom, take me to another circle of stones in the middle of the English countryside. This is exactly what 10-year-old me really wanted to do. I was not into the journey. My mom was very much into that journey, and of course I talked to her about it on the phone, and she continues to this day to swear that I will regret not having completed that journey towards the stone circle, which is apparently very famous on the cover and posters and whatever it is. But it wasn't my journey. It was her journey. Maybe I will be again convinced one day that it is my journey, but for now, it is not. And of course, I was originally going to title, you can see the original title of my sermon here was We Are What We See. But I have actually altered the title of this sermon, which is actually to ask the question, whose journey is it? That is the title of this journey. Whose journey is it? And of course, we are going back to the story of the Old Testament because, of course, I lifted the curtain last week and revealed to us that we've been kind of preparing for this all along. And one of the things we wanted to do was kind of bring us into the Old Testament sort of tabernacle system, the journey that the Israelites were on, and relate it to the journey that the Hebrews were themselves on. So I want to give the very briefest of overviews of what we talked about last week so we can get everybody up to speed. Remember, the story of the Bible starts in Eden, sort of declaring this heavenly sanctuary. And Hebrews begins the very same way, declaring the enthronement of Jesus in his heavenly sanctuary. It speaks to this, and remember we had this diagram here of the tabernacle. It speaks to a vision of what this most holy place is, this place right in the center of the tabernacle, which is sort of hearkening back to that vision of a holy place, a place where humans and God lived in harmony. But of course, there was a problem. The problem was sin and death. And that, of course, caused humanity to be exiled from this perfect community with God, not necessarily out of some sort of malice or scolding, which is where some people take it. It's like, oh, well, you just did a bad thing, so you've just been scolded by being sent to your room, kind of thing, which is really only part of the truth. The truth of the matter is God's very nature, his being, his presence, the person who he is just by very nature a sort of destructor of sin. It was actually a loving act because knowing that God's holiness would completely consume the unholiness of Adam and Eve originally, and then humanity as an extension, being sent out of the garden was in a way an act of mercy. But what's even more is God initiated another more significant act of mercy, which was to initiate this invasion. As you'll remember, that was the title of Dave Kenny's sermon all the way back when he was talking about what the tabernacle is all about. It was an invasion of God's holiness into unholy space. And so what exactly is this all about, this most holy place, this holy place? The whole project is God trying to figure out, how do I bring this destructive yet good, like a fire. A fire can be destructive, but it's also warm and comforting. You need protection from it, but it also provides a sense of peace and security. And that's exactly what God's presence is, and what he wanted to bring back with us so that we could be in full communion with him. So how can he invade unholy space and yet not completely destroy it? And so this is the setup that God instituted. And again, as a review, you have the holy space with attached to the most holy space. And then in the outer court, this is where atonement is made. This is where the substitution of a sacrifice of an animal is made in order so that the sin of the individual entering the holy space could be cleansed. And so what is being set up here is kind of what I'd like to consider a death barrier. If God is sort of the destroyer of death, and if his presence cannot be in the presence of death, and if death is now within the world, what does God need to do? He needs to create a barrier. He needs to somehow separate himself from the death that's around and in order for an unholy people to come in communion with him. And so that is kind of what this Holy of Holies is, this holy place. It provides this barrier so that it protects not only him and his own presence, but it also protects the people that come into there so that they are not destroyed by God's presence. But what God didn't just simply do, which is just create a place, sort of this embassy of holiness, and then create a barrier in which no unholy thing could enter, he created a pathway. And that is, of course, what Jack was describing through the Sermon on the Day of Atonement and so on and so forth, where there's this a way in which God allows for unholy, unclean things to be brought into his presence. And we see that it's kind of a three-step process. And this is just a little bit of review, but there's sort of this segmentation to it. I described it as different spaces last week. There's a space for this, a space for that, and a space for that. And so the way that God's sort of purifying journey is characterized is as a movement from one space to the next. And to sort of summarize what these three stages are, these three places, there's a place for the sacrifice of the victim/animal. There's a place for the passage of the priest with the blood of that sacrifice victim into the realm of the holy. And then, of course, in the third space, there's a presentation of the blood for purification and for relationship. Three different spaces on this unification journey with God, a way for an unholy people to be with a holy God in three different spots. And of course, it is a journey, and that is one of the things that I sort of hinted at last week, and I want to get into a little bit more in depth, because there is this sort of inherent journeying that's happening. We often think as Christians, when we look to the event of the cross, and we think of it as doing sort of one thing. It was one event, it happened, and there it is. But from an Old Testament perspective, it wasn't necessarily this kind of one and done thing in one event. There's this journey of atonement that happened, this journey of unification as represented by these different spaces. But of course, we in our sort of English language, Western, we read left to right and so on and so forth. It's as it's depicted here, it looks kind of like a backwards journey. And the reason why it is often depicted in this way is because specifically in the Old Testament, the opening, the entrance to the outer court was needed to be at the east side of the tent, of the tabernacle. You need to enter from the east, and then the journey was from east to west. In the Old Testament sort of mentality, the sort of east to west journey represented that movement toward the holiness rather than a regression. And I wonder, and this is just, of course, speculation, I wonder if this has to do with the fact that their language was, of course, our language is from left to right, but their language is from right to left, the Hebrew language. So this is something that I didn't do a lot of thinking in. It's kind of a speculation that perhaps there is a kind of a linkage with sort of the directionality of their language. But for the purpose of this sermon, I want to flip it. Understanding that, of course, in actuality it would have been sort of an east to west journey. But I want to really solidify our mind and not confuse the fact that what we are talking about here is a progressive forward journey. That the destination is this holy place that's just sort of epitomized by the Garden of Eden. And it's this journey that the people are on in order to get back there. It's very similar, in fact, to something that we have already stated actually in many sermons ago. So this is just a bunch of review. Way back in Advent, you'll recall that I put up this slide. You of course remember it because, of course, my sermons stick very deep into your hearts. So as a quick review, we talked about the overall mission of God during Advent. What is the overall mission? And we highlighted that at Eden, or at the fall particularly, there was sort of this separation that happened between God's space and human space. God's domain, human's domain. They were at one point one in Eden, but then they got separated. And I put this slide up last Advent, sort of demonstrating what is the overall mission of God. So this is not something that is new to the tabernacle. This is not something that's new to the Hebrews. The entire mission of God has been about taking two things that were separated and bringing them back into unification, to bringing that unholy space and to purifying it and making it holy so it can be one with God. Again, a journey that began with the book of Genesis and is continuing on even to the book of Revelation for events that we hope to be fully realized in the future. And of course, let's look to another sort of pattern that is happening within the Bible. And remember, Dave Kenny preached a sermon called Patterns, Patterns, Patterns. He was sort of showing how the tabernacle pattern was very much along the lines of what God had been setting up all this time. And so this is a map of Egypt and the Holy Land. And of course, we know that they were on a journey towards the Holy Land in the Old Testament. We talked about this in Numbers. We had a 4-part series in Numbers about everything that happened from Egypt all the way to the Promised Land. But what do we learn that happened in the midst of this journey? Well, there was trouble. Well, there was sin. There was correction. There was all sorts of difficulties. People weren't quite following after what was going on. There was sin. There was separation from God. There was all sorts of mayhem, if you will, within the people of God as they're on this journey to this holy place. And so even if I look at that wilderness journey of the people of God, the parallels are striking to the very same journey that God has been bringing his people on the big scale and on the small scale in the tabernacle. There's a holy place that people were moving towards. And along the journey, there was sacrifice, death that was happening. And of course, this was not done in some way as to sort of just simply punish and scold and say, shame on you, because there was a purpose for this. Remember what we talked about in the book of Deuteronomy and about how God kind of used that opportunity just before they got into the holy place as they were crossing through that barrier to get into that land. What were some of the things that God said? First of all, we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13. What did God say he was doing all along the way through the wilderness journey, through the book of Numbers, through what was happening to God's people there? Well, he starts off by saying, fear the Lord your God and serve him only. He was encouraging the people and reminding them that through all of this, the thing that he wanted them to learn is that they should fix their eyes on him, fear him, serve him only. All the while in the journey, there's this disobedience that was happening, this death that was happening because you weren't fixing your eyes on me, but it was as a way to help you remember that I am the one to be feared. I am the one to be looked upon. Deuteronomy 6, chapter 16, do not put the Lord your God to the test. And he reminded them about how there was all sorts of waywardness, people saying, oh, well, God is not going to rescue us from this time. And he said, no, remember that God provided you every step of the way. Whenever there wasn't water, I provided water. Whenever there wasn't food, I provided food. And of course, one of the most what I think is most profound statements from God as a summary of what all this was, if you went through Numbers and we didn't quite understand what was going on with all that, why was it that all of this sort of mayhem was happening in this? Like, why is it that constantly people were not following after God? What was the point of God's seemingly harsh reactions? Here's where God kind of lifts the curtain and says, here's what I was doing with you along the way. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may possess the land the Lord has promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. God, in his tabernacle, I'm going to skip back to here, in his tabernacle pattern, we're going to go back to this one. God knew that just simply establishing this tabernacle wasn't just simply going to be enough. Just simply putting a tabernacle in the middle of the desert and having this journey through the tabernacle. Actually, we're going to reverse that as well. We're going to put it, there we go, it's the forward journey. This journey out of this place with sacrifice and death towards a holy place. He knew that wasn't going to be enough because there was systemic things within the community. There was just a general lack of really committing to God. Some did, but many did not. He needed not only a localized tabernacle, he needed a large tabernacle. He needed a lifetime-sized tabernacle to teach the people that, yes, you do have this sort of localized space where you can meet with me, but actually the place where you're truly going to meet with me as a people is in this place that you are not even there yet. In a way, yes, you are on a daily basis almost going through this process of being renewed, having your sin atoned for in the outer court, and then that blood of that life force of the animal being brought into the holy place so that you might be purified and reunified with God. Yes, that is happening on a daily basis, but also in the span of a lifetime, you are on a journey of being purified, of being made holy, of being atoned for. And all the sin that is within your community, it is going to be constantly put to death in this outer court that you are in the wilderness. The wilderness is the outer court. The wilderness is this place where sacrifice is being made, not for the sake of just simply a scolding, but for the sake of the journey of being unified with God at the end. You see, we so often receive these tests along the way, these hardships in our lives as sort of punishments for the wrong that is being done. And in one sense, that is true, because of course sin must be punished. But on the other sense, in an even more deep sense, we have to understand what the objective here is it's not just as some sort of telling you how to do things, not just some sort of holding you to some sort of standard so that you can just behave in a way that is appropriate in public. No, God wants to be with you. And in your current state, you can't. You need his sacrifice. You need that chastening. You need that rebuke. You need that sacrifice in order to be with him. And what happens to us individually must also happen to us, the church. The book of Hebrews, by explaining how we can see again through Hebrews chapter 2 that we are being identified with Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should be the pioneer of their salvation, but should be the pioneer, perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. There is that unification with Jesus. We are one with Jesus, but yet we are still in the outer court with Jesus. Our sin is still being sacrificed. We are still not yet at the most holy place, for the most holy place we anticipate is the new heaven and new earth. The book of Hebrews is sort of helping us understand that to be a church is not to expect that we're going to arrive at some place in this life where things are just to be relaxed and comfortable. Yes, there might be opportunities for respite. Remember, even in a sermon that I preached many weeks ago as well, even in the middle of the desert, there were oases, there were springs, there was manna, there was opportunities for rest and restoration. There was water that came from the rock to provide restoration for their bodies and their souls. But one thing that God let them know very clearly is that we are not done yet. This is not a place to be rest. This is not a place to rest. There was temptation to rest at Elim. There was a temptation to rest in the desert so that they could just be done with all this. For after all, how good could the promised land actually be? And for us, there's the same temptation. There's a temptation for us as a congregation to arrive at some sort of reality, to arrive at some sort of state of our communal being and think, this is pretty nice. Let's stay here. Or perhaps we might find ourselves in a wilderness experience like we are now. And the thing that we might be looking forward to is the thing that was, because that was very nice and very comfortable. But the thing that Hebrews is imploring us to understand is that we are a people in wilderness, by definition. The promised land is the culmination of all things at the end of days. Until that day comes, we will continually be in a place of renewal, of sacrifice, because there are still sins to be atoned for in our midst. We are still a people who have had their sin atoned for, and yet we anticipate the full atonement, the full reunification with God at a later date. So we should not expect that we should just simply be able to rest and take it easy for always, because there's still things in our community that needs to be sacrificed. There are still, and just as God encouraged his people at the doorstep of the promised land, he said, look back at everything I was doing with you. Look, I was doing all of this so that I would humble you. I was intentionally humbling you, as Deuteronomy 8 said, in order so that you might know that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. And what hope do we have that we will actually be able to accomplish this plan? How can we know for sure that we are able to get through this? Well, because Jesus has already gone through this journey as well. Turn in your Bibles, if you have them, to Matthew chapter 4. We preached on this many months ago. And it's a good reminder in a time where we are maybe coming to realization that we are in a wilderness. Matthew chapter 4. Starting in verse 1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Jesus answered, it is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. But Jesus answered him, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Many of you might already know this before and have recognized this before, but Jesus is using Deuteronomy 6 and 8 in response to all the things that the devil is tempting him with. Here is Jesus in the wilderness. He has been tempted by the same things that the people were being tempted with in the wilderness. He's being tempted with the same things that we are tempted with now, but yet Jesus prevailed. And we know how this story ends. Jesus fought back every single one of these temptations and showed himself to be the true Israel, the true obedient people who goes through the wilderness but doesn't succumb to temptation. And so see the encouragement that comes from the writer of Hebrews at the end of chapter 2. Because, at verse 18, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. There is a sort of nervousness that comes with this reality that, we are in the wilderness, and this is not a reality we're going to escape, but yet there is hope. Because as it says earlier in Hebrew, in this very chapter where it says that we are his brothers and sisters and we are identified with him, that we are one of the same people, we are brothers and sisters with Jesus himself, we are going on this journey with Jesus. This journey from outside into the outer court of sacrifice, going into a new heaven and new earth that we anticipated. We do not do this alone. We do this with the creator of the universe himself at our back. Now, of course, this is not an invitation for us to simply rest and do nothing, because, of course, the very next verse, chapter 3, verse 1 in Hebrews says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in this heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest." And so my encouragement for all of us here is to recognize we are in the wilderness, and we won't escape that. We will escape this type of wilderness, but what I'm sure we'll find is after we get out of this, we will find another wilderness experience, because the moment we find ourselves not in the wilderness is, in fact, the moment when we have settled for Elim without fixing our eyes on the promised land. There will be moments of rest, but on our journey as a church, we have been through 2,000 years of continual wilderness, and to be the church is to be in a wilderness process. Because that it is in the wilderness where the sin and unholiness that is within us is sacrificed and put to death so that we can enter into that promised land. So let us not avoid the wilderness as a place that is just simply uncomfortable or unpleasant, but welcome it as a place where we can be one with God and have the unholiness within us removed so that we might, as a church, experience this new heaven, new earth reality that is awaiting for us in the end. Let us, as we do this, fix our eyes on Jesus and stand firm in him. For us individually, the wilderness is a very easy time for us to kind of turn our gaze away. And gosh, Numbers has been a very great example of this. But let us not fall prey to the exact same thing that the people in Numbers faced. The writer of Hebrews, being a Hebrew himself, would have known the story of Numbers. He is invoking the same imagery of the journey. And he is imploring us, as he was imploring the original readers of this, to not go the way of these people who drifted away, who saw a place of temporary respite and said, hey, let's stay here permanently. Let us continually fix our eyes on Jesus. Let us commune with him intentionally. Let's not leave it to chance. Let's not neglect our regular communion with him. Let's not neglect gathering with one another and spurring one another towards love and good deeds, as I'm sure we'll have preached on us later in Hebrews, which is from Hebrews chapter 10. But let us continue to fix our eyes on Jesus through this time. And even while we are in a wilderness and it will be challenging, know that what awaits us as a people and as individuals is a holy place where we live in communion and unity with God himself. Amen.